were able to make all the way to the COP27 that's held in Sharm el-Sheikh, and in cooperation with the Insurance Federation of Egypt and the Moroccan Insurance and the French Insurance Federation, Moroccan Insurance Federation as well, we thought to have this important session, and this session will have very important subject. Today we're going to talk about the drought, and you know that the increase of drought is a phenomenon that affects the entire globe, from sub-Saharan Africa to the heart of Europe and the United States. During the period from 2000 to 2019, more than 1.4 billion people suffered from drought. This means that drought is a disaster that affects the second highest number of people worldwide. With 134 droughts, Africa was the most affected by drought of all continents in the world during the period from 2000 to 2019. More than half of them took place in East Africa, but also in Europe. Drought becomes an increasingly important issue in 2022. Nearly two-thirds of the European were in warning conditions, or situation of drought in Europe seems to be in the worst in 500 years. 2022 was one of the hottest years at the global level, and droughts frequency and duration increased almost a third in 20 years. This phenomenon has direct economic consequence by increasing poverty and social disasters. It's a global character, asks therefore for a targeted approach and coordinated solutions on a global social in a global scale to strengthen resilience to a present and extreme droughts. In this resolution on the implementation of the United Nations Conventions to Combat Desertification, the UNCDD, in those countries experiencing serious drought and/or desertification, the UN General Assembly has affirmed that the combating desertification and the dangers and the drought can facilitate the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. I'd like, before we start, to invite Mrs. Mrs. Florence Lastman, President of France Assurance, to give her keynote speech.
Good morning, all of you. It's always with great interest that my federation, France Assureurs, joins the COP events. And for this edition, I am even more grateful to have the opportunity to hold this meeting together with our sister federations of Egypt and Morocco. And when I remember our first conversation, I think it was in Prague, that led to this event today, it was obvious for the three of us that drought would be the topic. So you will ask me, why drought? As insurers, risk is our job. It's our core business. And managing risks means forecasting, mapping, analyzing, preventing, and finally repairing when risks occur. And what's the state of play on risks today in the world? All prospective risk reports point out climate change as the current biggest risk for the future. And as insurers, we've been noticing for years now that the impact of droughts affects the entire globe, from sub-Saharan Africa to the heart of Europe and Americas. And drought, apart from the episodes of great fires, which are of course very, very impressive, drought is a relatively quiet danger, more discreet and insidious than floods or storms. But the fact remains that the multiplication in number and intensity of drought episodes will lead to the aggravation of a number of risks. Forest fires with consequences on biodiversity, damage to agricultural crops with direct consequences on human health, hydroelectric output reduction, disorders in buildings related to the phenomenon of shrinkage and swelling of clays. My federation sponsored last year a prospective study on the potential cost of all natural disaster in the next 30 years in France. And according to their model, the models made by scientists and economists, this cost could double in the next 30 years compared to the past 30 years, going from 74 billion euros to 143 billion euros. So a doubling globally for all natural disasters in France. Now, if I focus on drought, for drought, the cost should triple from 14 billion euros to 43 billion euros. So this illustrates the impact of drought already today and of course again in the future. And it's so important for us and for insurers in my country that we keep studying that risk. We will publish next week a new study on this phenomenon of shrinkage and swelling of clays, but I can already share some of the conclusions with you this morning. So in France, the drought episodes impact the clay grounds that retract when they are dry and expand when they are humid. And as a result of that, we discover cracks in the buildings. And this phenomenon is expanding because we have more and more episodes of drought. And I discovered through that study, for example, that today the majority of drought episodes does not take place in summer. In fact, 55% of drought episodes take place during spring, autumn, and winter. My fellow citizens in France are pretty lucky because the consequences of drought are covered by our natural catastrophes schemes, which was created in 1982. The scheme is a public-private partnership. It is universal, it is solidarity-based, and it guarantees individuals, companies, and communities to be compensated for direct material damages caused by a natural phenomenon. This scheme already covered for the past 30 years more than 3 million damages since its inception. The financing is ensured by a premium, the rate of which is uniform across the territory and set by public authority. Practically speaking, individuals in my country will pay somewhere around 25 euros per year, which is very modest, I would say, to be covered against this natural disaster. And this is thanks to the principle of mutualization of risk over the territory. Of course, compensation is very important, but still more important is prevention, because the best claim, policyholders and insurers will tell you, the best claim is a claim that did not occur, and did not occur thanks to prevention. That's the reason why we propose to boost significantly the research programs on this topic. To conclude, and coming back to the global level, it's obvious for me that to address efficiently the complexity of drought phenomenon in the world, we need to mobilize all the forces of society. And that is the reason why I'm so eager to listen today our distinguished speakers. And I will now leave the floor to Mr. Mohamed Hassan Ben Salah, President of the Moroccan Federation of Insurance and Reinsurance Companies. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, President of Egyptian Insurance Federation, Madam President of France Insurer, ladies and gentlemen. Addressing the Continental's heads of state at the African Action Summit held on the sidelines on the COP22 in Marrakesh, His Majesty the King of Morocco declared, and I quote, "I propose to design a climate-resilient Africa, an Africa fully committed to the path of sustainable development. It's an Africa that will use its resources in an optimal way, respecting environmental and social balances." End of the quote. Numerous environmental threats weigh on our society all over the world. The Africa continent is not immune. It's even more threatened and more often exposed. Global warming, to take just one example, is leading to environmental degradation at considerable financial costs. It has become the first risk multiplier for society, causing economic disparity, health problems, increase of immigration, and tension between nations. Faced with these challenges of sustainable development, our sector is on the front line. As insurer, the nature of our business is to help individuals and businesses to mitigate risk while protecting their assets. However, we must not lose sight of the fact that our sector is among the most impacted. The emergence of new type of risk is challenging our traditional modeling and may endanger our stability. Ladies and gentlemen, in the Moroccan market, this topic has always been part of our priority. Concrete action have been implemented with the public authority in order to mitigate the impact of climate phenomena. In January 2020, our country has set up a compulsory insurance coverage against several natural and man-made risks. It's a great sign that we have sent to our fellow citizens and to our economy a very concrete way to project ourselves into the future. In 2011, we had set up as a part of a public-private partnership, a climate multi-risk policy that covers several risks, including drought, express water, and hail for various agricultural crops. This multi-risk climate insurance have been very successful and now cover over 1 million hectares. What brings us together today goes beyond climate risk protection. According to the United Nations Environment Programme, the principles for sustainable insurance also focus on social and governance issues. All Moroccan insurance companies are fully committed to this framework and have signed the principle for sustainable insurance. Most of them are also corporate social responsibility certified. In addition to this action, our effort must be placed within the framework of a global regulation and ecosystem which encourage the consideration of sustainable development issues. In this respect, we have made a commitment to the Moroccan Public Authority, the bank sector, and capital market by signing a climate finance roadmap which ambition is to secure sustainable finance. This roadmap is based on three major guidelines. Expanded the beneficiary of our climate coverage offer and continue to develop dedicated insurance solution. Second, support Moroccan energy transition by financing energy projects and investing in green fund. Three, integrate the environmental footprint into investment policy of insurance company. Like other institutional investors, insurers are called upon to participate in the collective effort by favoring a more responsible investment paradigm and is contributing to the shift toward a sustainable economy. At the same time, the growing awareness of clients who are more and more concerned about the future of society and the planet give us the opportunity to offer green or committed saving products. Ladies and gentlemen, the organization of COP22 in Morocco has accelerated the kingdom's effort in favor of sustainable development. The signing of a memorandum of understanding with the European Union on October 18 this year to establish a green partnership is a good example and makes the kingdom the first country to conclude a partnership of this type with Brussels. I'm convinced that COP27 will be the same catalyst for Egypt and its insurer sector. I wish you all the best and success in this way. Thank you.
Many thanks for Mrs. Florence Latsman, the President of France Assurance, and also to Mr. Mohammed bin Salah, the President of the Moroccan Insurance Federation. Thank you very much. We actually were expecting to have with us also as a keynote speaker, Mr. Ibrahim Tahir, the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Conventions to Combat Desertification, and he promised to be at the end of the session at the closing remarks. Now I'm going to invite our speakers, our panelists for this morning, and I'd like to start with Mrs. Joy Tyndall, the Director, Environment Dedication OECD. Can you please join us? Mrs. Tyndall, a Director, Environmental Director at OECD since 15 September 2020. She oversees the implementation of the Director Program of Work, covering a broad range of environment issues, including green growth, climate change, biodiversity, quality of ecosystem, eco-innovation, circular economy, and resource productivity. She was most recently New Zealand High Commissioner Ambassador to Singapore. And thank you very much for joining this morning. I also would like to invite Mr. Stefano Signar. Please join us. Mr. Signar, the head of the United European Commission, and he's Italian, a qualified lawyer. He spent his early career working on a banking supervision at the Italian Central Bank. He joined the European Commission in 2000. Between 2004 and 2008, he worked in the private office, vice president, responsible for migration and secretary. He became head of the he became head of the unit in 2009 in the Directorate General of Justice, Freedom and Security, working in the Directorate General for Home Affairs from 2010. He oversees programs in the area of the migration. Thank you very much for joining us. I'd like also to invite our third panelist, Mrs. Ikweshi Elaine, the Insurance and Development Forum. She is the Secretary General of the IDF, a public-private partnership led by the insurance industry and supported by the World Bank and the United Nations, aiming to enhance the use of insurance to build greater resilience against disasters and help achieve the United Nations Global 2030 agenda. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. Last but not least, I'd like to invite our fourth panelist for this morning, Mrs. Karina Wali, the head of public sector AXA Climate. Karina is the head of the public sector at AXA Climate, working with development banks, governments, municipalities, development finance institutions, impact funds, and non-governmental organizations to advise and support in adaptation, current and future climate risk management, and financing topics. She plays a leading role for AXA in the Insurance Development Forum, and which brings together the insurance industry, the UNDP, and the World Bank on climate risk. Thank you very much, Karina, for joining us this morning. So in order to start our questions this morning, I'll actually go by order. So my question for you, Joe. What are the common challenges that are faced by the developed and emerging countries in addressing the increasing frequency and intensity of droughts? And what are the differences in the challenges?
Well, thanks very much for the question, and this is a really important topic. I think the insurance sector I have heard described as being the canary in the coal mine. In other words, giving advance warning of the seriousness of the climate crisis. As we've already heard, drought is affecting all parts of the world. No one's immune to it. And the problem with climate change is that it doesn't result in any redistribution. So dry areas get more drought prone, wet areas get more flood prone. And those extremities are becoming more and more frequent and severe. One thing that hasn't been mentioned, I don't think so far, is the issue around increasing urbanization of the global population. And we've seen a number of cities facing incredibly tight water crises around Sao Paulo, Cape Town, and more recently Chennai in India, for example, where things got to a very difficult point. You've already mentioned that Africa is especially badly hit, with 44% of all droughts in the last 100 years occurring in the continent. But of course, the northern summer showed that the US, Europe, and China, parts of China, were particularly badly hit. The UNCCD predicts that 3/4 of the global population could be affected by drought by 2050. So droughts, however, are not all the same. And different parts of the same country are obviously potentially affected quite differently. So some droughts are slow onset and leave policymakers with more lead time to kind of prepare and deal with them. Others are flash events, and those are much more problematic, I think, to manage. Drought can affect soils only, so it's particularly prevalent for agriculture, or it can affect water sources. And equally, it can affect both soil and water sources. So each of these needs a different response. While agriculture is especially affected, it goes beyond that to social, ecological, and economic impacts. Things like food, water, and energy security, as well as biodiversity protection. And responses to those different pressures may conflict with each other. So coming up with a coordinated and coherent policy response can be very difficult. Another difference is it can affect both energy demand, if you need additional electricity to pump water, but also energy supply. And we saw that, we've seen that with hydropower, obviously, but also with nuclear power in France over the summer when the water became too low and too hot to act as a coolant. So I think that my final comment would be that this is another climate impact that is hitting low-income, agriculture-dependent countries harder than others, and we need to factor that into the response as well.
Thank you very much. Yeah. So I'll move to the second question and go for Stefano. How the EU has been supporting countries in Africa in the area of climate and disaster risk finance and insurance.
So thank you very much. Good morning, and thanks for the invitation and for the question, Mr. Chairman. I will mention two building blocks, two elements. First of all, as you may know, the European Union is the first humanitarian actor in the world, but we are also a big development actor. And in this area, I mean, if we stick to the area we are talking about today, we have started working in the area of climate risks some 10 years ago. When we started, in particular, a cooperation with the World Bank through the Global Fund for Disaster Risk Reduction, and we have mobilized a total of 80 million euro over 10 years. And with this, the first entry point has been create a country system, an ability for the countries to assess and measure risks. So basically to work on data. Because if you don't know what the risks are, what are the more significant risks, then you cannot mitigate or protect. And this, by the way, is a work which is also very much relevant for the establishment of early warning system, which is also an area where we have been working quite a lot. So this has been, let's say, started some 10 years ago with the creation of country profiles and a lot of analytical work accompanied by training, capacity building, etc. Coming from that perspective, what we have been doing in more recent time, and this leads me to the second point, is the support to regional risk pooling mechanisms. Basically mechanisms through which, let's say, we, through either capital injection or premium subsidies, we have supported the creation of regional capabilities to basically insure against certain risks. Just to make an example, we have just signed a few days ago another contract with the African Risk Capacity, which is, let's say, an initiative under the remit of the African Union Commission. And for instance, this has allowed to mobilize $10 million at the moment of catastrophic floods in Madagascar, which in the end, let's say, went to support smallholder farmers. So the intervention is primarily through sovereign support, but of course the final beneficiary are most of the case smallholder farmers. So this we have, by the way, similar regional risk pooling facility in other parts of the world, the Caribbean, Pacific, Southeast Asia. And let's say, of course, the challenge about that, but I will come back in the following question, is how to make this, let's say, how to scale up and basically make a bigger impact through these mechanisms. Let me stop here for the benefit of time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me go also for the third question here, and I'd like to ask you for the what kind of solutions to strengthen the drought resilience are already generated by the governments, and in which way insurance can work together with governments to elaborate these solutions.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation to be part of the discussion. I really also appreciated the interventions of the other speakers referring to very tangible examples of some of the programs that are already existing in terms of insurance mechanisms. I think, governments are doing quite a bit in terms of trying to address climate change and reduce the impact. But the reality, as was mentioned earlier, is that the impact is really very profound for many governments and really very challenging, complex, and expensive, right? They're trying to balance the need for investments in education, health, whilst at the same time trying to deal with the impact of disasters. So we're talking about very complex situation that governments are doing, at the same time still trying to address what is really a profound crisis. I would like to perhaps hone in a little bit closer to what does drought mean in terms of impact on individuals, right? Which is linked to the second part of your question. And I think sometimes we take it for granted. Florence mentioned the fact that droughts are very sinister events in the sense that we know when the rains have failed, but oftentimes resources are only mobilized for low-income populations when the signs of a drought are visible, right? And by the time those resources are mobilized, it is 6 months, 9 months after the drought has already been acknowledged as an event. And so what we can do and what we have been doing as the insurance community, as the IDF, working with the public sector, is to try to create a more efficient system. How can we leverage our understanding of risk, connect it with financing so that we can get resources to people when it is needed? So when we know that the rains have failed, why can't we get resources to the poor farmer so that he or she can undertake the necessary preventative acts? So a lot of the work that we do within the IDF is based on the recognition that this is a complex situation that the private sector cannot address alone. And so there is a need for public-private partnerships. Because if we are focused on the most vulnerable communities, these are often communities that might not be able to afford insurance, right? And so that is why we are seeing programs such as the African Risk Capacity, the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, programs being instituted by national governments, as we've heard about the Morocco initiative, to actually try to create systems that can connect when an event occurs with the finance and making sure that it actually gets to individuals. So within the IDF, we have structured a number of programs around this. The first being a program that we launched last year called a Global Risk Modeling Alliance. And this was launched by the IDF industry members committing resources to work with the V20, which is a group of 55 of the most vulnerable countries, to say, how can we work with you to deepen the risk analytic capabilities within those countries? And the importance of that is not simply for insurance purposes, but it's also for understanding that early warning purposes, earlier interventions, etc. And so that's something that I think that we can be proud of in terms of a program that is very tangible, but also leveraging private sector finance to address what is a really difficult public sector, concern. And as a result of that, we've also heard recently the announcement of $21 million to support the scale up of this intervention. The second program, which we are also engaged in, is how do we get to scale? So we've instituted a program with the United Nations Development Program, which is very tangible, I think. They're engaged in many countries around the world, having conversations with governments around their national development plans. How do these plans speak to risk and the role of insurance, right? So that's also a way of mainstreaming the role of insurance risk reduction, risk management in these conversations. But part of that is also working with governments to design real solutions. And we have programs in 16 countries around the world, which I think is a really good start for something that we launched only in 2019. And really to, again, try to distill what is the particular risk that you're concerned with, and then what are the kinds of risk financing solutions that we can structure to address that. And I think that that is an important conversation when we consider where we are. In Egypt, climate change, conversations around mobilizing finance and mobilizing especially a private sector within this space. So I said a lot, but I hope that gives you a stare on the things being done by the public and private sector.
Very interesting. And the cooperation between the private and public sector is needed, and I think you're right. And from this, let me move to the head of public sector at AXA Climate. Simply, how can insurer help build drought resilience?
Well, I think I'll just like to reiterate and summarize a little bit about what Ekosway said, because I think it's quite important just to get those clear concepts of the value of insurance across. I think the first one is around, and I'm talking to people who know this, what is the value, the number one value of insurance? It's swapping uncertainty and volatility for certainty. And when that basic concept, you have a lot of other multiple benefits that come from that. So you've got, for instance, the development of contingency plans, because you now know how much money you will be receiving. You can then plan around that. And once you've got plans, you can move faster, you can move in a coordinated manner. Secondly, you can avoid having to reallocate funds from productive investments. For a government, that means not having to pull money out of social investments in hospitals and schools after a disaster. On an individual basis, this means not having to sell your productive assets like your livestock and falling into poverty traps. And thirdly, you can take more risk. When you've got insurance, you've got the certainty that you can invest more. If you've got a loan, you can actually know that you'll be able to pay back this loan. So insurance, in theory, in the application of subsistence farmers, for instance, the theory is that this will allow, insurance over years will allow them to graduate to commercial farming. And insurance, in theory, is one of the necessary functions for economic development overall. And the second aspect, besides this, swapping of uncertainty for certainty, is the quantification of risk. So what Ekosway was saying about this, the GRMA, and all the work they're doing on the risk modeling, that's exactly it. Insurance needs to understand and price the risk to be able to function. And so we've obviously developed these natural catastrophe models since the 1980s that have got more and more accurate. They're not completely accurate, but they give a good picture and a real quantification of what the risk is and how much the potential loss and damage will be, for instance, for drought. And once you've got this quantification, you've got a more precise idea of the financial impact, and then you can again start planning how to finance this, whether it's reducing the risk, whether it's insuring it, whether it's creating funds on the side to actually deal with this. So I think that's the quantification is the first step in really dealing with the risk. And another element would be stronger databases. Public asset data insurance will require a lot of information on the actual assets. So it's bringing in that data along with it to try and quantify the risk. And so these kind of basic benefits really yield much more value than in terms of resilience, and you can apply that to the context of drought. So I'll just give a few different examples. Obviously, everyone's mentioned ARC, so I probably won't go into it too much, but I worked at ARC before with Ekosway and Kip in the audience. I think there are so many innovations around this because it's African Union, it's African owned. It is bringing in innovation through parametric insurance with satellite data for fast payouts. It's targeting the most vulnerable. It's bringing in the humanitarian sector. It's putting contingency planning at the forefront to say if you need to act fast, you need to have a plan in place before you can even be allowed to have the insurance. It's all putting it all together to be as fast as possible. And speed means reducing the overall cost. I think it's very key if we're going to have climate change exacerbating the cost of drought. Other areas are it's a bit different from ARC, but on a national level. This is through the IDF. We've been able to, with Swiss Re and Munich Re and other key players, build an agriculture national scheme for the Mexican government, they've been at the forefront already in insurance for climate disasters, but there were some problems with the initial programs they'd created. So we're trying to redo that to try and get payouts. Same thing with parametric insurance directly to the farmers after drought so that they can get back on their feet quickly. But there's other clever ways of aggregating, to try and try and reach the vulnerable people as efficiently as possible. So one of the programs we've done is with L'Oreal, where they had supply chain risk because they are using a lot of raw materials from single geographic zones. And if there's any kind of shocks that the farmers are subjected to, they might stop farming that product, which creates a real supply chain risk for L'Oreal. So what we did was we focused on 40,000 female shea butter collectors in Burkina Faso. We created, again, parametric drought and health cover because they were completely uninsured for health. And they received a payout this year after a big drought in the country. So it's using the corporates as another way to improve the resilience of the most vulnerable. And just because I think this was brought up by Joe, hydro cover and hydropower and water utilities are another key water sensitive area that will be very, very impacted in the future. I mean, already. So, there are already a lot of insurance around this. So creating water, lack of water covers for hydro dams, creating lack of water covers for water utilities. We're in discussions with the city of Cape Town to try and understand how could they use that insurance to ship in more water or create desalination plants, etc., to try and react fast. So I think I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And also very glad to hear that this cooperation among all these insurance companies, I think it will work well for the efforts that everyone is doing here. I'll go back to Joe, and I'd like to ask you about there are some notable solutions governments have identified to increase the drought resilience. How can insurer cooperate with the governments to implement such solutions?
Well, thank you for this question. It's a really interesting points I think have been raised. Sorry about that. I don't know whose fault it was. I think the idea is already being developed across the panel that traditional insurance has focused on financial compensation for loss of income that's affecting communities and so on, crop-based insurance, building insurance, that kind of thing. But the time is more than ripe for shifting from that kind of approach to one that is more preventative rather than sort of dealing with the disaster after it has happened. We need to move the ambulance from the bottom of the cliff to the top of the cliff. I think as losses go up, insurance becomes less viable, both in terms of reducing the coverage that insurers will provide, but also, of course, in skyrocketing premiums. This isn't a drought-related example, but back where I grew up in Christchurch, New Zealand, we had a major earthquake, or several, in fact, over a decade ago. Home properties and commercial properties became uninsurable for a period of time. You just could not get insurance on those properties at all. And that's a real wake-up call and a real problem that has to be resolved. So yes, moving the ambulance to the top of the cliff, and there are some really interesting examples I hear. I can just note. So what governments need to do is bring risks down to acceptable levels and affordable levels, and that means shifting from an approach that emphasizes emergency preparedness and response to one that builds resilience through longer-term prevention measures. And examples include changes in crop rotation, forestry management, but also building codes and spatial planning, which can help in terms of prevention. Governments need to create the right enabling environments to encourage that prevention ahead of time and reform the kind of perverse incentives that are there. So a couple of examples outside of Africa. In Australia, water trading fosters dynamic responses to changing water availability. Price signals like higher tariffs were considered by Israel to address water scarcity concerns. And I think that water allocation regimes around OECD countries that we have looked at show that if well designed, these regimes can foster innovation and investment in water efficiency. So it's a question of government regulation and insurance price signals to encourage adaptation. And you've also already talked about risk sharing, and there are some good examples there. One was in France that recently adopted a regulation to better share risks between farmers, the government, and insurers in case of extreme events. That regulation sets a cap above which all damages are insured by a public compensation scheme, but the scheme rewards insured farmers by providing higher compensation than is provided for uninsured farmers. So it sets a different set of incentives with some good results. So my final comment is to pick up on your point about data and information. Super important to have those and to improve the quality and scope of data and information. Both government and the private sector need to work together on that, and that is one area of kind of expertise from the OECD point of view. And we did work to develop indicators, including for drought, as part of our climate hazard assessments that are reflected in a publication we launched at the beginning of the week called the Climate Action Monitor. Thank you.
Perfect. Let me go back to Karina, because I think there's some linkage between what you've said and what I want to ask you about the other stakeholders that could be involved with the insurers in order to build the capacity for the drought resilience.
Well, I think there's two main areas. There's obviously the setting up of the insurance scheme, and I think the work that's been done with the tripartite through the UNDP and especially the German government funding these kind of schemes has been absolutely invaluable. So we've been able to do 16 country projects through the IDF because of this funding from the development banks. So I think having that support from the donors and the Global Shield, which we announced on Monday, 170 million euros again from Germany, but hopefully from others, to be able to set up these kind of insurance schemes, create the catastrophe models, gather the data in country with the governments, create the legal environment for an insurance scheme, engage with all the different stakeholders that are necessary. I mean, it's a lot of work. They're 2-year projects just to set up the insurance program, and it's all funded. I mean, half from our time in kind, but also from the German fund. So I think if we can expand that, perhaps it could be Green Climate Fund could get involved in financing that. Could it be the EU perhaps would be interested, the Adaptation Fund? And then the other sector would be all the relevant actors in the target sectors along the entire value chain. So if it's agri, it's farmers, cooperatives, the agricultural banks, the chambers of agriculture, also the local insurers building up their capacity. Is it SMEs? Is it mobile phone operators for the distribution? So that's, and lastly, I guess, just to reiterate what everyone's been saying, the government is essential. I think if you want scale, if you want quick impact at cost efficient, you've got to leverage where possible the kind of government infrastructure, the financing through premium subsidies. It has to all be integrated into that process. And then lastly, I think the OECD, for instance, is advocacy. So bringing in all the different stakeholders are already involved in trying to show the value of insurance, trying to get that message across in a neutral way, how impactful it can be. But beyond that, and I think linking into what Joe was saying, is that you've got this, how can we leverage the insurance markets modeling skills, that risk quantification? So can we take a step back and use the risk models to actually quantify what is the current risk today, integrate the climate models to say by how much will that increase in the future, depending on what climate scenarios you're going to be looking at, and then to work with specialists to say what are the different adaptation investments that we need to focus on to reduce the risk in a cost-efficient manner, and what are the most cost-efficient ones of those adaptation measures that we should be concentrating on. And then whatever's left in the residual risk, that's where we start to say how much of that should be, how much of it should be using debt, how much reserve funds, and trying to balance out where insurance should play a part versus other financing tools. So for this, I think there's a whole ream of other stakeholders to take into account. But again, the private investors, development banks, the governments themselves need to get involved on investing in the adaptation to reduce the risk as much as possible, and work with the insurance market on that.
Okay, I think also, can you also comment on this and also give us some idea about the initiative that the IDF has been taking recently in this area as well?
Thank you very much for that. I'd actually like to react to a comment that was made by Joe, because I thought it was quite interesting when she pointed to, incentives, right? Incentives that help us to address this issue of risk reduction, right? And how do we do that? And I will give you perhaps a little bit of an anecdote. I'm Nigerian, but also Barbadian. And in the Caribbean, we have hurricanes, right? And we had a situation where a specific group of insurers put forward a policy where they would offer a risk reduction in cost of premium for those clients that put on revetments on their roofs, right? But suddenly there were other corporations that came and offered, reduced coverage without the need to invest in risk reduction. But that was also very instructive, because it was also, what is the role of public policy in that, right? Because the government had the opportunity to step in to say, okay, well, let us enforce certain building codes and certain building standards. So that is a situation where the insurance industry is trying to encourage a certain behavior to align incentives, but they also require the support from the public sector to establish the standards that we want to adhere to. But it also touches on, I think, another point that Joe rightfully raised, which is the limits of insurance, right? And I think that this is something where we need to communicate with people around what that is and why risk reduction is also quite important. At the same time, the reality is that we are in a world where developing countries, we are still talking about 2 to 7% in terms of insurance penetration rates, right? So these countries do not have the same level of shock absorption that a New Zealand, a United Kingdom, Switzerland have, right? And so we have to think again about what are those protection systems that those countries, those individuals, those communities also deserve. And it's a bit of a challenge to the public sector as much as it is a challenge to the insurance industry to think about these new systems that are required. And I think that when we think about, again, going back to the conversation that we are having here about loss and damage and financing, it is about protection. It is about reliability of finance. It is about the future, the security to plan for the future. And I think that that's a really great opportunity, even though it is very challenging space to exist in. So I will now answer your question. In terms of
I know you're gonna, but okay.
In terms of the stakeholders that are involved, I think Karina has given a very great sort of example of the shift that we are seeing. 2 days ago, we heard the German Chancellor announce the global global shield against climate risk. That came from the recognition that there is a need to look at how we invest in ex-ante financing. If we look at the experience of COVID, only 2% of financing was prearranged to deal with that. The numbers are not that much better when we think about climate events, right? And so that effort is about how do we shift and increase the availability of that ex-ante financing, because that is also how we can, again, drive greater consideration to risk reduction, early preparation, and all these things that we know that we need to do. And it's important because it's how do you align the role of the private sector versus the role of the public sector? How do we leverage the resources of both to do the right thing? And so from my perspective, what we are seeing at the global level in terms of the global climate shield is really, and it came out of an endorsement of the G7 as well as the V20 countries. And that is on, what would one say, on not traditional constituencies coming together, developing consensus as this is something that they should do. So that is, I think, a representation of a global community working with the insurance industry, because the IDF was also actively involved in that. Also a commitment made by the IDF of 5 billion in capacity to support those governments that want to work with us in the development of solutions. So that's at a global level. But again, at an operational level, when Karina talks about doing work in Mexico or the L'Oreal project, or, and I'm sure I see the colleagues from Morocco, the complexity of implementing these programs, it's a raft. It's not only private institutions, various insurance companies that you have to engage, it's various public sector institutions. And we often talk about public sector as though they're a ubiquitous entity, right? How do you get the ministries of environment to work with the ministries of urban planning, with the Ministry of Finance, and come up with a coherent conversation that we can have around risk? So it's not a straightforward thing, but I think that insurance offers an opportunity to focus on risk, to get the right people around the table, to have informed discussions around how we deal and manage with that risk, and hopefully to also address the trade-offs. What are the risks that insurance cannot cover that we need to be doing more of in terms of risk reduction? So it's complex. I can't give you all the stakeholders that need to be involved, but I think most of us know the actors, and we certainly have to learn, given climate change, bringing more people into the fold around this conversation.
It's good that we have a live streaming, so a lot of people now hearing who should be involved in this, which is very important for us. Actually, I wanted to make use of having Stefano with us and ask you, what about your views in the future? How do you see this going, and also how do you think the EU intend to support the upscale of this area?
Okay, should be fine now. No, thanks for the question. In any case, my job is made easier by the remarks made by my fellow panelists. Let's say we definitely want to do more in this area. So there is a commitment to scale up the work in this area. To be frank with you, we are faced with 3 challenges, which I think are the challenges that everybody faces in this area. The first one is the one of fragmentation and coordination. I think some initiative aiming at better coordination have been mentioned. Of course, we are participating quite actively in the Insur Resilience Global Initiative, but of course also more recently in the Global Shield. We know there are others, initiative, V20, etc. But I think this issue of better coordination of intervention in this area is paramount, also because first of all, we need to be, focused, effective, etc., but also to create the right incentives, because in fact, we know how tricky it is to make a premium subsidization, what is the level, also because whatever we do has to be sustainable. We cannot create a system whereby we need to subsidize in order for the things to keep working. That is not the way it can be. So this is the first area where I think further work is needed. Also because, let's say, the framework is clear, but it's not always so easy to identify the most effective delivery mechanisms. So implementation is quite a challenge. The second element is to be innovative, to also find new ways to tackle those challenges. For instance, the role of the utilities. We see that in many catastrophes, hurricanes and so on, the utilities, in fact, are not protected, which is quite a paradox because they are, in principle, actors which can support, let's say, serious risk protection scheme. So this is one of the areas where I think we need to work. And last but not least, I think our challenge currently is how to involve the private sector in that. Because let's say that we are going towards a situation where, in principle, we work through the risking and providing guarantees to our development financial institution so as they can better support, let's say, it can be commercial banks or any other, let's say, economic actors out there. And what we have seen is, in fact, that in this area, it doesn't happen. We haven't managed yet to, let's say, mobilize guarantee support through our toolbox for, let's say, private sector-led mechanism in order to protect from those kind of risks. And we know that, for instance, in sub-Saharan Africa, there is very little interest to work in this area, although we can mobilize support to the risk number of those risks. So for the time being, we haven't been successful, although we have been in conversation with a few of the financial institutions, KfW, to mention just one. But definitely this is a challenge that we need to face if we want really to go to scale and be more impactful. Thanks.
Thank you. I have last question before we ask you to give us some final comments. And this question go for you, Joe. What role can the OECD play to advance policy making on DOT?
Yes, thank you. And I think I alluded in the answer to the previous question to the OECD's role in helping with data and information needs and in developing indicators to help governments with their policy making, and particularly around understanding the potential impacts of climate risks and hazards. And we have developed an indicator to look at average cropland soil moisture just recently, which is a very specific one. Well, what we are about to do is launch a program of work on climate-induced drought risk management. And that the aim of that is to look at ways to increase resilience to drought through ex-ante preventative measures. As I said, getting the ambulance back to the top of the cliff rather than the bottom. We do, in doing that, want to take account of the complex interdependencies that exist both across sectors, whether you're talking about water, energy, and also or spatial planning, as well as across different levels of government. So that's central government, regional government, or local government at a city level. We started a project recently with Paris to explore ways to strengthen the city's resilience to climate-induced water scarcity. And so our approach is to look at risk management in an integrated way, just as the other panelists have been talking about. We want to work with the insurance community to be part of this program and project we're launching, to help design the right policy environment. We're all about trying to identify and encourage best practices, and you can't do that unless you bring all the right actors together. So we hope we can have a collaborative approach that brings the industry, the sector on board as well. Thank you.
That's good. Please keep us informed when you launch this program so we can also get some information. Okay, I think I finished my questions, and we still have 10 minutes. If there is any question from the audience, that will be appreciated. If you have any questions, yes, please, Florence. Florence, you can take the mic, Florence.
Thank you. Just one comment. When you said that, well, what I understood is that the role of government is to assure that the risk do not become too important, too high, skyrocketing premiums, so that the risks continue to be assurable by insurance companies. I think there is an alternative to that, which is exactly what we've been doing in France with the CatNat scheme, which is to have a public reinsurance scheme. So sometimes, of course, and in the future, we all hope that through adaptation, in particular, we will be able to reduce the level of risk. But in between, I think we need public-private partnerships and, for example, having a governmental warranty on some sort of reinsurance schemes on top of the insurance scheme, I think is one solution that can be supplementary to all the solution and ideas which have been mentioned in this beautiful panel. Thank you.
Totally agree. Yeah. Any comments on this? Yeah.
Well, thank you. I just wanted to react to that and endorse that, Florence, in the sense that, you know, in many of the countries that at least my experience has been in, is that those systems don't exist, right? So we're trying to build them, right? And so it's also about sensitization to the different types of strategies that governments are taking. So again, referencing the case of Morocco could be very different in terms of how Egypt would approach that. Same thing with Nigeria or South Africa, right? But the fact is that we had to do work to provide an entity that those governments can also interact with in the development of these kinds of solutions, right? And so that's the work that we are trying to do within the IDF as a partner with the public sector to have those conversations. I think that historically, the issue of climate risk has been there. Countries have been dealing with it. But it's really come to the fore over the last few years, right? With the impacts that we are just seeing, relentless. And also the issues with COVID-19. So I think that this forces, I think, a greater conversation that we need to have within the development community about how you treat to insurance and risk transfer as part of the development strategy and engagement with governments, right? Because it's not been top of mind, because those experiences have not been as visceral, right? But we are there now when you think about the challenges around adaptation, responding, the humanitarian crisis, the absence of funding, etc. So I'd just like to encourage, you know, we're trying to create a platform where the industry can engage in a coherent manner with the public sector on these issues. So definitely have a door open to OECD Joe, as well as, you know, the EU, to explore these ideas, because we also need innovation. We need to understand what is happening in many other jurisdictions, right? But we also need innovation. And we need the public sector, not only governments, but also others who have a chance to influence governments on the strategies that they should be employing.
Yeah, agree with you totally. And also agree with Florence. If there's any other question from the audience? Yes, please.
Yes, thanks a lot for all the debates. It's very interesting. Maybe you mentioned a lot of programs with new partnerships. And one of the key questions we have in France is how we also raise risk culture, like how we create risk awareness in the society as a whole. And we had a poll in France, and we saw that only 30% of the French people are aware of the risks in their region, which is really not a lot of climate risks. So how through all the partnerships, all the programs you're building, are you also touching the whole population to build resilience across the whole society?
Yeah, who would like to take this one? Stefano? Yeah.
Yeah, no, indeed, the risk awareness is a key issue. Let's put it this way. Of course, in those situations where the risks are very visible because the climate impact is evident, in principle, let's say people are aware, but of course they don't have necessarily a way to cope, or let's say because they live in vulnerable conditions. But overall, it is true that by enhancing awareness, you can help prevention, because prevention starts from from the bottom of the society. So sometimes even very simple things can save lives and can save the loss of property, etc. In a number of our programs, we have supported also, let's say, enhancing climate risk awareness in populations, but also, let's say, administration, local communities, etc. Now the problem is always how you ensure that you go to scale, because of course, as I said, that there is a risk of fragmentation. We have been doing a lot of nice things, but sometimes in doses which are not the ones that are in sync with the needs. So the problem is, at least in my opinion, is really to support those government policies that mainstream climate risk consideration in the different public policies. It can be education, it can be social protection, it can be, administration and so on. And this is not easy, but I think that there are a few nice examples. For instance, in Bangladesh, the government has done so much of an effort to really include climate change in many of the sectorial policies. So there are good examples, but I think the problem is always to how you make it sure that your scarce resources are used at the best of the possibilities, because, as I said, risk that you spread it too thinly to be really impactful. Thanks.
Thanks. Just very quickly, and my response is not purely drought related, but I think risk awareness comes home to people when they are directly impacted, and it's kind of hard to do things in advance. So a couple of examples that I was aware of when I was living back in New Zealand. One was a very simple one, and that was lines that were painted across streets to indicate where sea level rise would end up. So if you were living below that line, you were going to be submerged, or it's a simple thing, a blue line across the road. Also, video simulations that have screened, and documentaries that have been made that show in graphic terms what some of the impacts might be. One of the things I think government has to think about, and that is the division of responsibility between central government and local government. There was a community, a local government just in New Zealand around the coast, and they did a study which indicated the housing communities and housing areas that would be badly impacted by coastal erosion due to climate change. That was challenged because the homeowners said, this is affecting the value of our property. You can't possibly do this. and they had to kind of withdraw the report. But that is an object lesson. So often, insurance is used to kind of rebuild or recreate in the same area where the same problems and risks are going to occur again and again. It makes absolutely no sense to rebuild a house that's just going to drop off a cliff into the sea as coastal erosion happens. So I think there's work to be done to get better coherence at the government level around regulation in ways that that also take into account the value of property.
I was just going to say, I think that we can do a better job as a global community in terms of risk literacy. I think one of the things that we saw from COVID was, people have a complex time understanding risk in that sense. So I do think that there is a lot that insurers can do, and this is why there is this emphasis on the risk modeling bit, right? Because it's not just data for data's sake, right? But it's how do you translate, if it's the Earth observation data, combine that with vulnerability information and communicate that in a way where people know what they are doing is a risk that they are taking, right? And again, the link to public policy, what is the consequence of that action, right? So I do think that there is a lot of scope for really innovative things. The reference to Bangladesh, I think, is a remarkable one. Last year at COP, they joined our event, and it was a story of a country where a few years ago you'd have an event pass through Bangladesh, and it's hundreds of thousands of people dead, millions, right? But now it's a few people, and I'm not saying that that is acceptable, right? But it shows you, the remarkable change, transformation through investments in information and awareness building. And so the priority for that government now is reinforcement of that. And by the way, that was also a partnership with really interesting communities, with Google and others, right? In terms of improving the availability of risk information. But now the question is, you protect lives, but can we protect livelihoods? And this is where the conversation around insurance is also important, because it's an issue of protection of, yes, assets and all these different things, but it's also about protection of livelihoods so that people can live and grow and have businesses that thrive, and they can't take those risks without a certain guarantee of protection, right? And so that is the work, I think. And yes, there are challenges and there are all these different elements that we have to contend with, but it is a huge gap, not gap, sinkhole, right? Absence, right? Yeah, it's an absence. And so the challenge for us is, yes, we have the issues with the insurance and all of that, but it's almost a duty and a responsibility to think about protection and what is the role of the existing infrastructure and architecture that we have to bolster that, because the issue is urgent. So that's how I view this space. But yes, a lot of work to be done on risk literacy.
Okay, Karina, do you have also a comment on this? Or?
I'll be really quick. It was just, and it's completely unrelated to drought, but I just thought Hurricane Ian, the devastation in Florida, but just the fact that insurance price should signal the level of risk, I think is one way that insurance can directly show you risk awareness. So if you do have subsidized premiums, etc., and you're kind of dampening that signal, you can have things like what's completely perverse, that the entire Florida coastline is now, tripled in exposure to hurricane risk because maybe the premium hasn't shown what that real risk is. So I think insurance can be very direct in that way as well.
Yes, I think with this we come to the end of this session, but I really want to thank our speakers today, Joe, Stefano, Equisra, and Karina. And actually would like also to thank both the federations, the Moroccan Federation and the French Federation, for the cooperation with the Egyptian Federation. Actually behind all this, there were a lot of meetings and preparation. I'd like to thank particularly Emily for the job that she's done, and also Dr. Tariq Bashir, Christian as well. Thank you very much for the job that you've done. I really appreciate it. And last but not least, also, I'm sorry to say that Mr. Ibrahim Tahawi could not join, and he sent his source that he couldn't really join the end of the session, but we understand that he's very busy. Thanks again to our high-level speakers. Thank you very much. It has been a very informative one, and I think the future is clear now. A cooperation between both public sector, private sector, insurers as well should do the role, but I think we cannot do it alone. As you said, premiums will never be equal to pay all these claims, so the government should also participate in supporting the insurance companies and the private sector. And I think there's a lot of things to be done, and I hope that we can continue this discussion with the same panel, which is very high level panel, in the future, maybe in Egypt or France or Morocco, I don't know. But actually, I think there are a lot of things to be tackled, and 1 hour and a half is not really enough to understand and to get all the information that you have. And also, we'd like to follow up with you on the future, how it will work. And we need to hear from you in the future. I think we'll have a channel to communicate. How can you help the African and the Middle Eastern countries? Because actually we do have a lot of risks that we suffer from, and I think this is a global problem. Thank you very much once again, and allow me to thank also our audience. Thank you very much. Can you have a picture?